Slides are visible. Can anyone confirm? Yeah. Okay. So let's start with the session. So in the last week we have covered the several spectroscopy techniques like photocaustic FTIR, Raman spectroscopy, atomic absorption spectroscopy, or ESR, and ESR. Yeah. So let's start with the photoacoustic. I'll be giving a brief uh, introduction about the photoacoustic spectroscopy. So, photoacoustic spectroscopy is different from when it is combined with the FTIR. It is different from the only IR spectroscopy, only IR technique. In terms of the absorption, it gives better selectivity. Hello. Okay. Okay. Let me check. Yeah. Oh. Okay. I'll check. Is it better now? Hello. Yeah. So starting with the photoacoustic FTIR. It's not going with the presentation. Yeah. So it is it requires a photoacoustic generator, wave generator. So for that, we need a chopper which can modulate the wavelength of the modulate the radiation of the light. So the intensity will vary, as you might have known. So the intensity can be high sometimes and then low, then high. So that is how the wave is generated, and so this wave is uh, can be considered as a sound wave because the modulation is happening because with the help of a chopper, and this kind of wave is getting generated. Then when mic is on, certainly your mic is on. Should- Yeah, so the acoustic wave when goes to the sample, it interacts with the sample. Some of the radiation will get absorbed, and some of those will be diffused in the atmosphere. That is, the atmosphere is having a gas inside it, and the gas will be inert, so it doesn't absorb the radiation itself. However, it will just the heat which is coming out from the sample, it's only getting dispersed in the environment. So that is how the expansion will take place, and then we can detect the how much is the expansion has happened, and with that we can actually detect the signal. So this is a typical instrumentation of the photoacoustic detector. So suppose the IR radiation is coming, it is going to the mirror, and with that, here the chopper is applied, and only selective uh, intensity, like we can value the intensity and the uh, decrease and increase of the intensity that we can modulate. So the modulator is applied over here. I hope my cursor is visible. So then the wave will hit the sample, and after hitting the sample, some of it will get absorbed and some of it will get dissipated. So in the helium atmosphere, it is getting dissipated. So the excited molecule give up that excess energy as heat through collational processes, and the heat diffuses to the surface of the sample where it creates a pressure wave or a caustic wave, which is then detected by the microphone, or a detector. So why helium is used uh, as an inert atmosphere? Because it has high thermal conductivity and low heat capacity. So it does not absorb the radiation itself, but only from the sample it will give the better signal because it is more sensitive. And the other purge gases that has some which has sometimes been used is xenon, because it is highly polarizable gas. It uses enhances its use enhances the intensity of the of groups perpendicular to the surface, and has been useful in studying the orientation of hydroxyl groups or others on the surface basically. So this technique of photoacoustic can also be used to detect uh, groups functional groups on the surface itself. And some samples are can be analyzed in the powder form or sheet form or liquid or pellets. So it is a very versatile technique in that way. We do not need any sample preparation also. We do not need any KBR or anything for that. Uh, because generally in the FTR we use KBR, but here we do not need that, and and there is no noise as such. The sensitivity of the instrument will be higher when we couple it with the photoacoustic detector. So the samples containing moisture that might require oven drying and all, which here in this case it is not required, and that does not mean that the hydrates cannot be analyzed, but they will not interfere with the signals. So the powders give some spectra similar to those of the obtained from the solid sample. So uh, there is this is a figure for the polystyrene basically. So both powder and sheets are giving matching signal basically. So because in the powder there is no scattering. In the normal FTIR, if you see, the scattering will be higher, so the noise, the signal will be very noisy. But in the case of PAS FTR couple, so here we do not get any noise as such. So the significance that we can analyze carbon filled rubbers, then we can quantitative do analysis of polymers, then surface analysis and depth profiling can also be done. So it can go up to the depth of 2 to 3, more than 2 to 3, so 10 micron to 10 micron. Then it can determine the orientation of function in the polymer materials. So here is a case study where the carbon percent is getting increased in a SBR rubber. So as we can see that when we increase the carbon percentage, the peaks are getting diminishing, basically. So this can be very well checked with the help of this PAS FTIR. Then another case study here, they have used two different kinds of samples, CSM and the carbon black, and then combined the two. So here also the bands are very well visible and different. So the number of bands in the 1800 and 1680 region here are is the spectrum of N110, uh, confirm the presence of the different carbonyl functionalities. So in the second one, and which may include the carbonyl groups lactone and quinine, etc. And the band at 1651 is the aromatic double bond. So likewise, we can select different materials and process the data with by matching these peaks with the literature with the characteristic peaks available in the literature or books, so that we can match and then we can select which group belongs to, like which peak belongs to which functional group basically. Then this is the peak for acetonitrile, acrylonitrile content. So here the intensity, like we can take the ratio of two intensity peaks and then we can check the which basically which functional group is getting enhanced by doping or something. So if you see here, we are doping 20 to 50% of ACM. So with doping, what how it is happening, like which functional group is increasing, that we can check. So this is the quantitative analysis of the polymer. Then another thing we can do is the content of styrene. So suppose we have a styrene butadiene rubber. So we want to check how much percent of styrene is present in the rubber as compared to the butadiene. So that we can correlate. So two peaks we can check. These two peaks 698 and 968. These are the peaks generally for the this kind of structure styrene. So from there the ratio we can correlate like how much is the percentage of styrene. So the surface analysis can be done and depth profiling can also be done. So suppose D is the thickness of the sample and D0 is the optical absorption length. That is the distance the infrared radiation can travel through the sample, which is equal to 1 by beta, where beta is the optical absorption coefficient. And dt is the thermal diffusion length, which is the length distance where the thermal wave has traveled through the sample. So in the optically transparent material, this d0 will be greater than d. The optical absorption coefficient is small, that is the beta is smaller. While in the case of optically opaque systems, d0 is lesser than d. The absorption coefficient is large. And in a thermally thin, that is very thin samples, the dt will be higher than d. So because the distance travel in the sample will be higher. Uh, so in that case, the thermal conductivity is large, and in the thermally thick, that is dt is less than d. The thermal conductivity is small. so the wave will not travel much in the sample. So in these cases, the signal intensity would be proportional to the product of the optical absorption coefficient and the thermal diffusion length. So here we can see that omega is the wave number, and the velocity is given by for the mirror velocity omega is equals to 4 pi, and OPT velocity it is 2 pi. So from here we can observe that the distance is a function of uh, omega basically, which is again dependent on mirror velocity and wave number also. So for different, and also the thermal diffusivity of material will also affect uh, the the detection. So the material which are having good diffusivity will give a better signal. However, uh, in the material which has less diffusivity, won't give much signal. So depend. So as I told that the for the surface detection, the uh, the analysis will be dependent on the wave number and the velocity. So as we increase the velocity, as you can see the mirror velocity, the and when we increase the wave number, the penetration depth will be less. However, when we decrease the wave number, the penetration will be higher. So, for the signals which are at the lower range of the IR spectrum, like suppose below 1000, it gives better penetration depth as compared to the one which are from in the higher wave number, that is around 4,000 centimeter. So this depth profiling can be used for different cases and to study different the functional group present at the varying depth or decreasing depth of the material. So these are some of the case studies I am stating this. So now we can determine the orientation function in the polymer material. So in order to determine the orientation effects in the polymer and polymer blends, during processing like extrusion and injection molding, a polarized PAS is essential. And for polarization of IR radiation, this KRS grid wire is used, and it is inserted immediately in the front of the cell. Uh, and without any special preparation, polarized PAs can be directly applied to polymer granules, blocks, sheets, strings, plates, etc. And in this way, the preferred orientation given by the machine axis can be correlated with the polymer structure and processing conditions. So the advantages of the FTIR, PAFTIR are shown here. So it is a very versatile technique. So when so IR actually is a very good technique which detects very small quantity of material, small concentration of material. But when it is combined with the PA photocaustic, it gives a better signal. It can be quantitative. It can be it reduces the noise, and the scattering will get reduced basically. So that's why it is very it gives very good signal when combined with the PA. And the spectra can be searched, subtracted, annotated, and so those can be done in the softwares. And so we can do surface analysis also. That is another advantage of the PAFTIR, and bulk analysis we can do. And also the sample preparation is not much. The, is not much. And the lack of necessity for any sample preparation offers many advantages, which include allowing this uncontaminated sample to be analyzed by other techniques. So no mixing with other reagent or anything, no potassium bromide is required, and since there is no contact in the sample with the sample, uh, so the sample shape or roughness does not affect the spectrum as it does with the ATR technique. So the disadvantages of FTR, PAFTR basically, uh, it, involves the wavelength range covered is limited because uh, only in the instrumentation the window of the PA detector is less. So that is the disadvantage. Then quantitation is possible even though the theory of photoacoustic spectroscopy is somewhat complex. But like we can do the quantitation, but the uh, analysis or calibration is sometimes becomes complex. And as a surface analytical method, the depth being examined can be varied by changing the interferometer. So now let's come to the Raman spectroscopy. So before that, I would explain how the light interacts with the substrate. So when light uh, it falls on any object, it can either reflect back, or it can either transmit, or it can be absorbed, or it can be scattered. So it depends on the property of the material on which it is getting. Uh, just a second. Yeah. So the property, like which phenomena will happen, like reflection, transmission, that depends upon the property of the material. So suppose the if a material is transparent, it will so the light will get transmitted totally. However, if material is opaque, the light will reflect back. So these are the different phenomena that can happen when the light interacts with the surface. So scattering is one of the phenomena which is very useful in the case of Raman spectroscopy. When we talk about the Raman spectroscopy. So Raman spectroscopy is a non-destructive chemical analysis technique which provide detailed information about the structural fingerprint by which molecules can be identified. And it is a spectroscopic technique usually used to determine vibration modes of molecules, although rotational and other low frequency modes of system may also be observed. And Sir C.V. Raman has invented this technique, and he has got a Nobel Prize also for this. So Raman spectroscopy can be explained on the basis of classical theory or the quantum theory. So for the classical theory, we need to understand the polarizability, different types of polarization, and what is polarization. Sorry. However, for the quantum theory, we need to understand the elastic polarization and inelastic polarization. So, what is polarizability? Actually, it refers to the tendency of a metal when subjected to an electric field to acquire an electric dipole moment, and is proportional to the applied field. So, when an electric field is applied uh, on the metal or element, then it will form uh, the dipole moment will change basically because of the electric field. So the positive charge will attract uh, and the negative will repel. So it is a property of a matter, and it is a property of all matter that is made up of an elementary particle which has an electric charge. So basically, proton and electron. So when subject to an electric field, the negatively charged electron and positively charged electron atom nuclei are subject to uh, opposite forces, and then they kind of separate. So with that, the molecule, which was spherical in shape earlier, can be elongated. So that I will discuss later. And the electric polarizer is the relative tendency of a charge distribution, like the electron cloud. So why we call it as electron cloud? Because the position of electron is not defined in a in a, like when it is revolving around the atom. So that's why we call it as a cloud. And so that is distorted from its normal shape by an external electric field. So this is how, like, suppose we have a carbon-carbon bond. So in the case of sigma bond, like when we put a electric field, it can either stretch and compress when the field is lower. When it is higher, it will again stretch like that. And in case of single molecule like H2, uh, the molecule will get elongated when we increase the electric field. So the polarization are again different kinds of polarization are there. So the first one is the electronic polymerization. In that, only the, like, here the nucleus is there and the electron is revolving around it. And when it is subjected to the electric field, the it is getting elongated. So the electronic polarization is associated with the displacement of the electron clouds. It is recognized that the polymerization, sorry, uh, it is recognized that the polarizability of a molecule can be obtained by simply summing the characteristic polarizability of its covalent bonds. So, depending upon the number of covalent bonds, we can sum up that and we can characterize the polarizability of the molecule. So the second type of polarizability is the dipolar orientation polarization. So here the electrostatic interaction align the permanent dipole of the molecule and causing the orientation effect. So suppose with zero electric field, when there was no electric field, the molecules were polar, but they were arranged in a random manner. But when the electric field is applied, the arrangement becomes very aligned. So this is the another type of polarization. Then the third is the ionic or atomic polarization. So here the atomic polarization arises because there is a relative change in the mean position of the atomic nuclei. So the nuclear position will change, and this this is similar to the electronic one, but here the ionic materials like ions are involved. So that's why it is a kind of a different type of it. So this is similar to observed at the radio frequencies. Then the fourth one is the interfacial polarization. So here the charges are aligned at the interface of two molecules or two materials. So this the charges are accumulated at the interface itself. So different so positive will attract negative charge, and that is how they will be aligned when we apply the electric field. So the dielectric response of the materials can be observed at the broad range of frequencies. So suppose we have electronic polarization that will be around 10 to the power 13 or 15, and for the ionic polarization it will be around 10 to the power 11. For the orientational it will be around 10 to the power 6, and for the interfacial and space charge it is around 1. Like it is it occurs very at the level of low level of frequencies. So now let's talk about the polarization ellipsoid. So in another polarizability ellipsoid is defined as a three-dimensional surface whose distance from the electrical center of the molecule is inversely proportional to the square root of the polarizability alpha. And that is along the line joining the point of the ellipsoid. So here suppose we have a so suppose this is a molecule and it was spherical in shape before applying the electric field. When we applied the electric field, the charges are getting separated. So this is the polarizability which is shown by the atom. Now the size of the induced dipole depends upon both on the magnitude of the applied field and on the ease with which the molecules can be distorted. So the polarizability is anisotropic because uh, like before applying the field it is spherical. However, when it becomes ellipsical, it is ellipsoidal. It is becoming anisotropic. So that means polarizability is anisotropic. So so from the minor and major axis of the uh, stretching or the separation, basically, we can know that the polarizability is high or low. So if the minor axis is very short, that means the polarizability is maximum, and if the major axis is small, that means the polarizability is minimum. So for different and molecules, the vibration will be different and the Raman activity will be varied. So the peaks can be determined in the Raman, and it has to be polarized. So the molecules which are polarizable, that only can be detected. So suppose for in the case of a CO2, the symmetric stretching will give a better signal in Raman. However, in the case of FTR, which we have seen, the symmetrical stretching will not give a good signal. It will not give any signal at all in the IR. However, in the Raman, it will the symmetric stretching will give a good signal, and the asymmetric will not give much signal. So, so that was the classical. So the classical theory is depend. That means that the signal will be dependent on the polarizability. Okay, and here this is the equation which is derived from which is derived in the lecture itself. So here you can see when there is no change in the frequency, here the Rayleigh scattering will occur, and in the Stokes and anti-Stokes the frequency will vary. So here the Stokes will be somewhat uh, lesser lesser intensity than Rayleigh, but it will be visible in the Raman. And anti-Stokes is even lesser intensity than Stokes, but it is opposite to the Stokes. So now, from the quantum mechanics point of view, the Raman spectroscopy is like we can describe it with the help of elastic and elastic collision. So elastic collision means both momentum and kinetic energy are conserved, while in inelastic the momentum is conserved but the kinetic energy is not. So in the Raman, basically we check inelastic collision, and here you can see. So when the energy levels are quantized in the quantum theory, and when the electron is getting excited and coming back to the same level, the Rayleigh scattering will occur. However, in the case of uh, Stokes, what happens that the electron goes up to a higher level, but it uh, again comes down to a level which is higher than the level of the initial or ground state from where it jumped. So that is the Stokes. How and when we talk about the anti-Stoke, the electron will come to a lower state as compared to the other one. So and so this is what is happening. So it has a particular energy frequency. Then when if the frequency is not changing, it is Rayleigh scattering. However, if the frequency is getting decreased, that is Stokes, and if it is increasing, that is anti-Stokes. So when light is scattered by a molecule, the oscillating electromagnetic field of a photon induces a polarization of the molecular electron cloud. This leaves the molecule in a higher energy state with the energy of the photon transferred to the molecule. So this can be considered as a formation of a very short-lived complex between the photon and the molecule. This is commonly called the virtual state of the molecule. The virtual state is not stable, but the photon and is re-emitted almost immediately. So the scattered light will be stock and anti-stock. So Rayleigh scattering and Raman scattering are different. So in the Rayleigh scattering, the electron of the excited state is excited to the virtual state. The electron of the excited state relaxes back to its original state, and the photon is scattered elastically, so leaving its original state. So there is no change in the energy basically. But in the case of Stokes, the electron of the excited molecule is excited to any virtual state and then relax back to a higher vibration state than it had originally. And the photon leaves with an energy of h nu minus delta v that can be scattered, that has been scattered inelastically. So in the Raman, basically inelastic collision happens. And anti-Stokes again. So here, in the case of anti-Stokes, the electron of the excited to a virtual state and then comes back to the lower vibration state that it had originally, and the photon leaves with a h nu plus delta e. So it is a this is the anti-Stoke, and it gives basically it has been scattered super elastically. So the anti-Stokes signal will be lesser as compared to the Stokes signal in the Raman. So this is a typical instrument of the Raman spectroscopy. We have a laser with which we excite the electron. So it is gone to like it goes to the dispersion beam, which is kind of a monochromator. So only particular wavelength goes to the sample. Here we have a polarizer and the sample Y is here. So the the we need to have very low energy, so low pass filter is applied, and then it goes to CCD, and then the signal is detected. So, on the basis of this understanding, we can differentiate between Raman and infrared. So, the infrared, basically absorption happens, while in Raman, scattering is the major phenomenon. Scattering is the phenomenon. And for the excitation, we have here polychromatic. So we have a range of wave number in the IR. However, in the Raman, we use generally a laser, which is a fixed wavelength laser, that is monochromatic. And the frequency measurement, here we measure absolute frequency. However, here we measure relative uh, frequency. And here in the infrared, the change in dipole moment is the criteria. However, in the Raman, the change in polarizability is the criteria. Then the selection rule for Raman. The primary selection rule for Raman transition is that the molecular polarizability must change. So it has to change the polarizability to become a Raman active. Then the polarizability of a molecule tells us about how hard or easy it is for an electric field to change or distort the electron cloud in an atom or molecule. So, suppose if the polarizability is very low, that means the molecules are not getting distorted. The electron cloud is not getting distorted. So that is the case, like we can check whether the molecule is polarizable or not. An atom in which the electron cloud is further away from the nucleus with a larger polarizability as F2. The symmetric vibration lead to relatively strong Raman signals, and here somebody is then asymmetric vibration leads to the much weaker Raman signals and are often quite strong in IR. So, with compared to the IR, the Raman gives like uh, the molecules which are inactive in IR, in Raman they will be active, and vice versa. So, the molecules are inactive in Raman, they will be active in IR. So, uh, that is the case. So the principle of like mutual exclusion here, the symmetric stretching, and those are active in the Raman, however those are inactive in infrared. And asymmetric stretching, it will be inactive in Raman but active in IR. And the bending, the signal can be very weak or inactive, but in the IR those will be very good signals. So here is an example of a PA moment. So the Raman shift is basically they are trying to show here. So the Raman shift is the energy difference between the incident light and the scattered light. So this difference is then only connected to the energetic properties of the molecular vibrations that is studied, and hence are independent of the laser wavelength. The Raman shift is usually expressed as the wave number here, as we can see. So some of the application of Raman spectroscopy. So it is very good for detection of the carbon material. The peak of the carbon is very well specified, very specific. in the Raman spectroscopy. So those can be used to detect signals for single walled carbon nanotubes, purity of carbon nanotubes. The electrical properties of the carbon nanotubes can be checked, sp2, sp3 structure, and whether it is diamond-like structure or coating, defects are there. So those kind of applications are there for the Raman spectroscopy. So this is a typical spectrum for the carbon material. So generally we get two peaks, the G peak and the D peak. So the G peak is the graphitic peak and D is for the diamond. It is considered as a defect sometimes because generally we want to check the uh, graphitic property of the material. So the vibration, if it is in the graphite form, so if it is elongating in this direction, that is the G peak will be having higher intensity. If the D peak is there, that means the breathing phenomena of the ring is happening. So it is going up and going in and out. Will be like that. So that is for the this D peak will come for that. And then there is a 2D peak as well. So this 2D peak is the uh, it's the sp2 carbon material again. So here the defects are, if the defects are there, then those will be visible. And sometimes it is also called as G star, and this is the signature of a graphitic to sp2 material. So and generally people use the Ig by Id ratio to indicate the defects or the graphitic, the ratio of the defect and graphitic nature in the material. And also the so this G can sometimes split in the D dash P. So that also shows the defects in the material. So as you can see here, the different kinds of D dash peaks are also there. So if we deconvolute these two peaks, we get two different peaks also. So those represent the difference basically. So at different wave numbers, we have different kind of different materials, and those are very specific to the peaks are very specific to the materials. Then we can use these for this spectroscopy technique for the pharmaceutical and cosmetics. So if we want to check the compound distribution in a tablet or the blending, whether it is uniform or not, and the throughput, etc. For that purpose, we can use a Raman spectroscopy. So, suppose we want to analyze the crystallinity of a material. So, this is a peak for silicon. So, this is monocrystalline silicon. However, in the case of a polycrystalline, the red curve will be there. That would be very broad. So, in most cases, Raman spectrum is sensitive to the degree of crystallinity in a sample, and this typically a crystalline material yields spectrum which is very sharp and that is very intense in the Raman peak, and an amorphous material will give a broader or less intense Raman. So these two states, that is the fully amorphous and fully crystalline, can be considered as spectral extremes. And the Raman spectrum from an intermediate state, that is partially crystalline or partially amorphous, will have characteristics which are intermediate to in terms of the peak intensity and the width or sharpness. So the difference between the intermediate states can be subtle, and it is often useful to have high spectral resolution capability, so the minor spectral changes can be confidently characterized. And for also for polymorphs, so if different phases are present in a structure, in a material, suppose this is for a TiO2. So different phase like anatase and rutile phase, two different phases are generally observed in the TiO2. So in these cases, we can easily, depending upon the peaks which we are getting, we can say that whether the material is having anatase or rutile or both. So the red peak is showing a more anatase property, while the blue peak is showing a more rutile property. So the phase change can also be observed. So suppose, uh, so sometimes it happens that when we anneal a material, the phase will vary. So at suppose at low temperature the phase was anatase 40 IO2, and when they have heated it, the phase becomes rutile. So the degree of heating, if they want to optimize, like how much they should heat or how at what temperature it should be heated to get that phase. So that can be checked with the Raman spectroscopy. Then the third application is the geology and mineralogy. So gemstones and mineral identification can be done with the Raman spectroscopy. Fluid inclusions, minerals and phase distribution in rock, etc. Then phase transitions, whether so the, as I have already told, then mineral behavior under extreme conditions, like heating or uh, low pressure conditions. Those can be detected. So here, an example of polyethylene is shown. So that this polymer is heated up to 144 degrees Celsius. So as the heating the temperature is increased, the peaks become broader. Some peaks got diminished, and some and the other became broader. So those shows that the which uh, basically which functional group is uh, getting involved in that after heating. What are the changes in the functional groups in the material? So those kind of things can be checked with the help of the Raman. Then, in the biological samples, like if you want to check for biocompatibility, proteins, bacteria samples, DNA, RNA, etc., those can be checked in the Raman because we do not need any high temperature conditions for this. So those can be easily detected, and also moisture does not affect the spectrum. So these samples generally have very high moisture content. So though that will not affect the signal. So that's a very good application for the Raman. So in that cases, so here we have the two different kind of material. That is, one is the protein rich pork muscle tissue, and the other is a lipid rich belly fat. So those can be seen here clearly, and the peaks can be seen very well. So it it shows that the different strength of Raman lines and background characteristics can be checked. However, detailed analysis of these spectra to extract significant biological information require advanced technical, mathematical, and processing tools. So, the quantification will be difficult for this, but we can get an idea whether the material is there. So, the Raman spectroscopy is able to detect and characterize the disease-specific biomarkers also that can reveal changes in the healthy tissues or healthy cells. Then in the it can be also applied for the semiconductor. So for to check the intrinsic stress strain in the material, this can be used. Then to check the purity of the semiconductor, alloy composition, structure defects, doping, contamination identification. This for all these for the electrical property calculation. For all the Raman spectroscopy is a very useful technique. So suppose we have this PaTiO2, that is a very PaTiO3. This is a very piezoelectric material. It's very useful material. So it has piezoelectric property, and here they have doped the copper and cobalt in the material, and with the increase in the concentration of the uh, cobalt, this peak is getting diminished. If you see, so the analysis of the spectra shows the sharp intense peak at 305 becomes fader with the cobalt doping, which is the result of the appearance of more symmetric cube. So the structure of the crystal can be checked with the help of this Raman spectroscopy, and doping effects can be checked. So there are numerous advantages of this Raman spectroscopy. Detailed chemical and molecular analysis can be done. It can be used to fully characterize a material's composition, and fast identification of unknown materials can be done. And uh, it can give information on the crystallinity, polymorphism, or phases of the material, and the intrinsic stresses, strength, protein folding as well, and hydrogen bonding also. And it is a very fast technique, and it does not require any sample preparation. It is a non-destructive technique. That means it will not completely destroy the material. It is a non-contact and non-destructive technique. And the microscopic spatial resolution is also another advantage. So the Raman is basically combined generally with a microscope. So we can see the sample where we want to do the analysis. We can select the region, the grains or particles where we want to basically check the property or the whatever we want to analyze. We can do the analysis on a particular section or region. Then we can have a confocal analysis also. A confocal Raman spectroscopy microscope is fully 3D spatial, so we can even scan the whole region as well. We can stack the at different depths. We can do the analysis. We can do the mapping also sometimes, and so it can be allowed to use for transparent sample as well. It is useful for polycontaminates, inclusions, and those found in the glass and minerals. Thin samples also can be classified, can be analyzed. Thin samples like cells, tissues, those can be characterized. And in situ and in vitro and in vivo also. That means in the cells, in the situations where we want to perform the experiment, that can be done. And in vivo means in the environment of the cells, that can be done. And also in the an animal also, like if we want to check, like in the perform in the skin or something, that we can do with the help of the Raman spectroscope. So the Raman spectroscopy versus other techniques. So Raman has a very good advantages, but it does not, like, it will be different for different techniques basically, obviously. But Raman microscope does not need any sample preparation, as I have already told. The environmental conditions are easier to handle. There is no vacuum, no heating. However, in the electron microscopes, we generally have to have a vacuum for the purpose of detection. Then the humidity should be less in the case of electron microscope. But however, there is no require of any heating, cooling, or any relative humidity conditions. This stage is also controlled, so you can move at a particular reason as I've already told. Then the analysis time is faster. The sample throughput is very high, and the startup is quite fast. It does not require any sophisticated technique to like start. Like it does not require much time to start, and analysis can be done in less than 10 minutes if you know the proper parameters. If the parameters are optimized, then we can analyze the sample within minutes. And multi-layer samples can be measured, so the band's footprint is smaller. And with the X-ray diffraction, the X-ray, both techniques can be used to assess the crystalline structure of the material. So it it can be used to check the crystallinity of the material. Then the advantages over XRD. So here in the Raman, the crystalline and amorphous materials can be measured. Single particle analysis is also possible. Then the environmental conditions are easier to handle. No vacuum, no heating or humidity or stage issues. And the footprint is small. That means at the smaller level, we can put several number of samples and we can do the measurements. Then the next technique is the atomic absorption technique, that is AAS. So AAS and AES, that is atomic emission spectroscopy, is a spectroanalytical procedure for the quantitative determination of chemical elements or by free atoms in the gaseous state. So, in this spectroscopy, the requirement is that the atom should be in a free state, a free ionic form or free individual without any bonding with the other elements. So, it is generally used to detect metals or heavy metals, but it can be used for other elements also. So, AAS is based on the absorption of light by free metallic ions. So, uh, this is basically used for metallic ions. And Sir Alan Walsh discovered this AAS and also manufactured it for the commercial use. The principle is basically similar to the absorbance, so, as we have seen in the other absorbance spectroscopy. Like when the light is getting hit on the sample, the uh, sample will absorb some of the light and emit some. So the absorption intensity is perpendicular is directly proportional to the concentration of the material. So we can correlate the intensity of absorbance and the concentration of the material. So here a monochromatry is placed between the sample and the detector to reduce the background interference, and from here the detector measures the intensity of the beam of the light and converts it to absorption data. And the sample is atomized. Basically we want to free the element from the other bonds. So we try to atomize it. It can be done either with a flame or with a graphite furnace. So the free atoms are then exposed to the light and typically produced by the hollow cathode lamp and undergo electronic transition from the ground state to the electronic state. and every element absorbs radiation at a fixed wavelength. So we know that at which if the material is absorbing at a particular wavelength, we know from that this wavelength is for particular material, and we can guess the material from that. So suppose if the peak is coming in this range to 28.79, so we know that the peak is of iron from here, and from the data we have, and we can conclude that the material is having iron in it. So this is a typical instrumentation of the AAS. It has a hollow cathode lamp, uh, and, and it is a chopper is attached, and it is going to the atomizer first. So the atomizer basically atomize the metallic ion, and then it goes to the monochromator and detector from here. So basically the flame is, this is the flame is, this is the atomizer. The heat of the flame produces the free atoms. In graphite FAS, the electrical energy in the graphite furnace produces the free atoms. Then the photocell produces an electric signal or current which results from absorption of photons. So from the absorbance, we can convert it into the current and then goes to the detector. So types of atomizer, flame atomizer are generally used. Flame and graphite atomizer are generally used. So these flame atomizer are, after being nebulized, the by gaseous oxidant and mixed with fuel, the sample is carried into the flame. So suppose this is the flame, and this is the primary combustion zone, secondary combustion zone, and the interzonal region, and it is allowed to atomize. So the atomization will occur here, and the sample reaches the flame in three steps. So first dissolution will happen, then volatilization, and dissociation eventually. So the ions will dissociate from the molecule. And other atomizers are also there: electrothermal atomizer, blue discharge, hybrid, and cold vapor atomizer. So normally the fuels which are used in these fuels and oxidants are used are natural gas and air. So it has a particular temperature and burning velocity associated. So if we want to go to higher temperature, then we need to take fuel as acetylene and oxidant as oxygen. So to get a very high temperature, and the burning velocity will also vary depending on that. Then we have an inductively coupled plasma spectroscopy also. So sometimes it is combined with the AAS or AES. So inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectroscopy is also referred as inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy, and it is a technique which can be used to detect the chemical elements. So here it will become more sensitive with the help of ICP. So ICP OES, that is inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy, and ICP MS, that is inductively coupled plasma mass spectroscopy. This is a very sensitive technique which can be used to determine even a very small amount of material, which is around ppb, that is parts per billion levels. So the that kind of concentration also we can detect with the help of the ICP spectroscopy. So the difference between ICP and AS, let's check. So here F means the flame and CF is the graphite flame. Okay, and AS is atomic absorption spectroscopy, and ICP is either so electrically coupled OES and MS. So the type of phenomena is happening in the AS is absorption in both flame and graphite furnace. Absorption will happen. However, in the case of ICP, emission is happening, and the detection limit is for the furnace AS it is around ppm levels, but for the graphite furnace level it is in ppb, and also for the ICP OES and MS both are in ppb. Then the sample throughput is it takes 15 seconds for per element, and the graphite furnace takes 5 to 6 minutes per element. But here the uh, in very less time we can check different elements, like 60 elements in less than 1 minute, or all elements in less than 1 minute. It is very fast. Then spectral interference, it has very less spectral interference, very few. But in the ICP OES, spectral interference will be high, and in the ICP-MS again the spectral interference is very low. Then chemical interference. In the case of FAS, these are very high. Chemical interference will be high. But in the case of ICP-MS, very less interference will be there. And in the uh, case of GFAS, the interference are very few. However, in the case of ICP, these are very few. Then sample volume required. So in the FAS, it requires very large sample volume, and in the case of ICP OES, medium sample volume is required. And for GFAS and ICP-MS, very small quantity of sample is required. And of course, the cost is an important parameter when we talk about spectroscopy techniques. So those techniques are very sensitive and also very costly. So, however, the FAS is moderately costly, and the others are very high. It has very high cost. So, the applications can be the forensic and biological analysis. So, we can, with the help of AES and ICP-MS, ICP, OES, MS, we can check the forensic test. Forensic analysis can be done in the blood or blood samples or brain or muscle tissues, and gunshot powders residues that can be checked in this technique. So this technology has vastly improved the accuracy of toxicology reports in cases of metal poisoning. Then common cases of metal poisoning such as lead, mercury contamination, those can be detected with the help of this, because uh, AS is generally used for the metallic ion detection. So the metal contamination, heavy metal contamination in water, that is a major problem in not only in India but everywhere in the world, because metal contamination happens from the industrial wastewater and the other pollutants. So that is a major problem. It goes to the sea, and it comes to the in the drinking water also, and causes very severe diseases. So, for example, mercury contamination, it causes Minamata disease, which is a, if you are aware of that, that is a very it is kind of a pandemic for that, because of the contamination of mercury. So those are very poisonous. And even in the biological samples, it includes both human tissue samples and food samples. The human tissue samples AS can be used for the determination of the various amount of metals and electrolytes within the tissue samples. So that can be used. So this technique can be used for that purpose. Then for the environmental and marine analysis, so as I have told, in the drinking water and wastewater to seawater, various contaminations are present. So this involves the determination of composition and concentration of regulated metals in the environmental samples, such as air samples, water, wastewater, soils, sludges, and marine environments. Then geological analysis, so we can check the uh, elemental composition of the minerals, rocks, and it provides valuable information on the commercial feasibility or conducting mining activities in areas explored. So, after mining, the ores and minerals need to be tested for composition and for the efficiency of refining operations. So, these can be done using this AS or ICP technique. And similarly, trace metal analysis, as I have told, is to as a great value of the for the perspective of the oil and water deposit. So those can be checked, and gemstones can also be created on the basis of the presence of metals, trace metals. So their elemental composition can also be checked. Then polymer analysis. So this is elaborated in the case studies and agriculture. So one common use of these methods is the analysis of soil samples and the effects of the quality on the quality of the soil will have because of the overall rate of fruit production in a certain area. So soil samples can contain high levels of phosphorus, nitrogen, often yield higher production volume, produce healthier crops. So this spectroscopy technique can be used to determine the presence of these elements and the quantity which they appear. So this is the case study one, which is the determination of organosilicon oxide polymer in tissue by AS using HGA graphite furnace. So here a simple method of extraction and determination of organosilicon oxide polymer is done, which is fixed tissue by AS. And using the Beer-Lambert's law, the concentration of silicon uh, can be correlated with the absorbance. So the advantage of this is that it has very high sensitivity. The detection limit can be up to zero point 0.1 microgram per ml for this concentration of organosilicon oxide. So you see the zero point 0.1 microgram per ml can also be detected with the help of this AS spectroscopy. Then mercury in plastics. So mutilation of mercury is a major uh, cause from the underwater pollution, and it comes from the plastic wastes at seashore, and it goes to the uh, inside the sea level, and it affects the marine life there. So the concentration of mercury in the surface level of the ocean is probably 3 or 4 times higher than today than it was 500 years ago. So through methylation, mercury is the ocean in the ocean becomes methyl mercury. So what happens? The mercury becomes gets methylated and it becomes methyl mercury, which is an organic form of the element, and it causes more danger. It is far more dangerous than it is in the ionic, and it easily concentrates while traveling up in the food chain. So in the food chain, if it comes, then it destroys the ecosystem, and it is very dangerous for the marine lives. And then if we intake these uh, in so that it comes to the humans or animals, then the whole cycle repeats. So this is the heavy metal toxification which happens because of the because this kind of contamination. So these heavy metal toxicants naturally adhere to the plastics in the water, and then that contributes to the mercury pollution levels. So the second case is the direct determination of mercury in the polymers by solid sampling graphite furnace AS, and it is a comparison of the performance of line source and continuum source instrumentation. So two sources are used here, uh, and they have used solid sampling graphite furnace AS for the fast and direct determination of mercurium polymers like plastics, and eight certified reference materials with a different composition like polyethylene, polystyrene, PVC, and other ABS were selected, and which covered a Hg content of around 20 to 1100 microgram per gram. So is one of the most interesting advantages of the use of GFAS is for the direct analysis of solid samples. And the is the potential for its technique for the selective atomization of the analyte. So we can directly use these bottles, and we can put it in the furnace, and then it will atomize the selective ion. So suppose this is a plastic, so it will evaporate, but the iron mercury will not deteriorate. So only that will get isolated, and then we can detect mercury how much it's present in our sample. Then the case study 3 is on cadmium imprinted polymer and its application to determine the cadmium via flow injection flame atomic absorption technique. So a new cadmium imprinted polymer was obtained via suspension polymerization. The beads were used as a mini column packing for flow injection flame. Then a flow injection flame AAS was used to determine the cadmium in the water samples. So they have used different samples from the different samples from different places like tap water, spring water, river water, fortified water. So with the help of FIAS, the uh, range was like they can detect, but it was not as better as the ICP-MS. So ICP-MS was showing better exact quantities as compared to the FIFS. Then the fourth case study is again on the mercury detection. So a novel lead imprinted polymer as a selective solid phase for extraction and trace detection of lead ions basically. So here I don't know why they have written on mercury. It should be lead. So a novel ion imprinted polymer as the selective solid phase combined with the flame atomic absorption spectroscopy FAS was applied for pre-concentration determination of lead in real samples. So the effect of various parameters, as you can see here. So in different samples like distilled water and tap water, the so it should be in the case of this FAS, it gives very close values. So they've added around 5 microgram and it gave 4.98. So it was very close. And then the determination of lead, copper, manganese by graphite furnace was also determined. Then by the separation, after separation, concentration using water soluble polymer. So here they have used PVP, that is a water soluble polyvinyl pyrolytin, which is having a chelating functionality, which can be used for the separation of traces of lead, copper, vanadium, and manganese. So these are so they have you added these prior to the determination and then checked like if it is detecting or not. So the sample and the PVQ solution were mixed and the color was changing. The metal bound polymer was precipitated by adding the mixture into acetone. Then the analyte elements were concentrated as needed. And then the concentration of trace elements was determined using graphite furnace atomic absorption experiments. Then the fourth is for reverse engineering. So suppose the polymer is having some kind of impurity in the form of metal like magnesium, silicon, calcium. These are some impurities which cannot be avoided sometimes. And if we want to check that in our rubber, for example, in a rubber sample, then we can use the ICP OES technique. There, this is reported in the literature. So this can be checked with the help of the ICP OES or also OES. So the elements which are active in AAS are represented here with the red color, and the blue color represent the AAS inactive elements, and the blue color and the yellow color shows the ICP-MS active uh, elements. So we can see that the range of elements for AAS and ICP-MS is high. And advantages and disadvantages. So it gives a very high accuracy and high sensitivity. It is a very sensitive technique which can give signals from up to big B level, that is parts per billion level, and it is easy to operate and it does not cost much in terms of the analysis. The instrumentation is costly, but the analysis is not that much costly. This technique does not detect non-metals. That is a drawback, and it is a destructive analysis because the material is getting burned, so it is heated up and getting atomized. So it is a destructive technique. Now let's come to the electron spinning resonance. So what is electron spinning basically? So electron has a spin on its own, as it is similar to the as Earth revolves around the sun. It has a spin of around the sun, and it also revolves around among its own axis. So that is the spin basically. So the electron also has the spin itself. So either spin up or spin down. So plus half or minus half depending on that. And electron spin refers to the form of angular momentum of electrons. Furthermore, it is a quantum property of electrons and its magnitude happens to be permanent. And the spin quantum number provides information about an electron's unique quantum state. So it uh, the the quantum, like the quantum number is giving the state of which the electron is there, and the electrons themselves act as if they are spinning very rapidly, producing tiny magnetic fields independent of those from its orbital motion. So electron spinning or spin quantum number is the fourth quantum number for electron in the atom and molecule. So it is denoted by ms, and the electron spin is constituted by either upward or downward, plus half or minus half. So if it is going towards north, it is negative or spin down. If it is going towards this side, like from south to north, it's up or half, plus half or spin up. So the magnetic moment, blue arrow of particle with spin minus half or plus half, uh, shows the usually gives a, it is not playing here, but it is an animation, but it is you can see in the actual slides of the lecture. So the motion ending from the top starts at the bottom and vice versa. So what is the electron spin resonance basically, and it is also known as electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopy. So ESR or EPR is a magnetic resonance technique which detects the resonance transition between energy states of unpaired electrons in an applied magnetic field. So it has to be an unpaired electron because if the electrons are paired, then plus half and minus half will subtract, will cancel out each other. So it has to be unpaired electron should be there. So if it so depending upon the poles, the electron will align itself. So if the energy is high, then the north will go, it will repel, or if the energy is low, the molecule or atom will be attracting. So the electron has a spin which gives it a magnetic momentum or moment. The magnetic moment makes the electron behave like a tiny bar magnet. So when we apply an external magnetic field, and that is the B field that here is shown here. There is a magnetic field. The paramagnetic electron can either orient in a direction parallel or anti-parallel. So depending upon the uh, magnetic momentum of itself of the electron. So the electric field are created by static charges, but the magnetic field are created by moving charges. That needs to be taken and that needs to be understood. So the magnetic moment, uh, it has either the measure of the object's tendency to align with a magnetic field, or it is a vector. So it describes the magnetic field created by the object. And one Bohr magneton is equals to this 9.27 into 10 to the power minus 24 joule per Tesla. The unit is joule per Tesla or Bohr magneton. So the magnetic moment can either be orbital magnetic moment or spin magnetic moment, as I've already told. So the orbit might be having a magnetic field, like magnetic attraction, and the spin is also having a magnetic. So if the energy is higher, then the separation will be higher. And so depending upon the if the microwave is radiated on to the electron, the spin can be changed, and the angular momentum can be uh, will be varied. So depending upon that, we can check the UV, that is the Bohr magneton, that is the magnetic momentum of the electron. So for 1 unit of magnetic mechanical angular momentum will be checked. So this is the angular momentum. Using this formula, we can check the angular momentum. So plus half and minus half again. So this shows the if the energy is in plus half, then using this formula we can check what is happening actually. So the presence of external field is the difference between the two energy states. So if the two are similar, then it will be zero. So that means there is no magnetic field. However, there is a change in the energy, then it will be showing that the energy field is there, magnetic field is there. So for different microwave bands for EPR, the microwave is again a very high range of wavelength it has. So there are different bands which are classified as such, like these are divided, like as we have divided into IR into mid IR, far IR, and near IR, NIR, and UV also UVA, UVB, UVC. So similarly, here in microwave also we have divided into different bands, and this is showing a particular different wavelengths, and so depending upon our requirement, we select the band and do the analysis. So then DPPH is a reference sample for this, which is a dark colored crystalline powder. Um, it is composed of a stable free radical molecule, and the DPP is a stable and well characterized solid radical source. So we have to have a radical uh, uh, in the case of this EPR. We need to detect, if we want to detect a sample, it should be in a radical form. So it is a traditional and standard of the position G mark, and the intensity of electron spin resonance signal. The number of radical for a freshly prepared sample can be determined by weighing, and EPR splitting factor for DPP is calibrated G equals to 2.0036. So this is a calibrated sample. So that's why it is a different sample. It is used generally for the calibration purposes. So the number of APR lines is 2 and I plus 1, and as I is equals to 1 and n equals to 2, if we take, then it is coming 5. So 5 APR lines will be there. And the relative peak intensity will be 1 is to 2 is to 3 is to 2 is to 1. So as you can see, 1, 2 and 3, then again 2, 1. So that is how the intensity ratio is there. And why it is coming like this, so I'll talk about it in later slides. Then the instrumentation, so we have a microwave and the controller isolator. This isolator controls the frequency and allows only microwave in unidirection. So only one directional wave will be going in the instrument. So then we have variable attenuator. So these variable attenuators, what they do is they are a electronic device that reduces the power of a signal without appreciably distorting its wave. So they are just reducing the power of a signal so that there is no distortion of there is no uh, the material will not get any kind of what to say destruction, and the signal will can be achieved. And then we have modulation coils and Hall curves, and the magnetic field sensor as well. And the lock-in amplifier is a type of amplifier that extracts the signal from a known carrier wave from an extremely noisy environment. But if so, it can so amplifier amplifies the signal, but the lock-in amplifier will further amplify the signal. And then we have gauge meter that measures the strength of the magnetic field. This is the instrumentation. So here we get a, curve like this, which is from starting from zero, going to positive and then coming back to the negative. So why is it happening like this? In electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopy, the conventional way is to plot a first derivative of the absorption with respect to the field rather than the simple absorption. And it is because in the absorption curve it is ubiquitous, particularly practically, because we need to differentiate the sample absorption. So we have to take the first derivative, and it is plotted like this. So in order to get the sufficient signal and signal to noise, the final information first derivative is taken, because in this kind of curves sometimes the noise becomes very high. So when we take the first derivative, the signal becomes stronger. So that's why the first derivative is taken. So the applications of these is it is found that definite correlation exists between the concentration of free radical and the metabolic activity of the plant material. So in those cases, the free radical in healthy and diseased tissues can be studied, and most of the oxidative enzyme functions via one electron redox reaction involve the production of either in enzyme bound free radical or by a change in the valence state or transition metal ion. So those kind of things you can check. This has been confirmed by ESR studies that much of the photosynthesis can also be checked, because in that also the radical formation will get absorbed, will get involved. So in that case, the photosynthesis bacteria, etc., that we can check. Oxidation of bacterial chlorophyll in vitro produces an ESR signal. So that is an important application. Then for the analytical application, so manganese plus 2 ion can be measured and detected even when present in trace quantities. So very small quantities can be measured. This method is very rapid and can be measured in aqueous solution over the range of 10 to the power minus 6 molar to zero point 0.1 molar. And ESR can provide a very rapid and convenient method, as I was told, for determination of vanadium in petroleum products, basically. Mm. And ESR can also be used to estimate copper, chromium, gadolinium, iron, titanium, and other metals. The ESR spectroscopy has been used to estimate polynuclear hydrocarbons, which are first converted into the radical cation and then absorbed in the surface of an activated silica alumina catalyst. Then, in the molecular biological biotechnique technology, in the DNA, RNA, protein structure and dynamics, activities of enzyme, glycobiology, etc., this method can be used. Then the reaction kinetics. A large number of organic reactions are known which can proceed radical mechanism. So most of the radical formation during organic reaction are not stable but are very reactive. So ESR can be used to study very rapid and electron exchange reactions also. Then the study of inorganic compounds. So ESR is very successful in the study of inorganic compounds. ESR studies can be used in knowing the exact structure of solvated metal ions. It is used to study the catalysts, uh, and the oxidation states of the metal can be determined using this ESR. For example, copper is found in a divalent in copper protein complexes, whereas it is found in monovalent in some biological active copper complexes. So the variation can be checked with this. The information of unpaired electrons is very useful in various aspects application of ESR, like spine label, structural determination, reaction velocity, etc. So that can be checked. Then in the polymers, basically ESR is have a very wide application, like in the polymer chemistry, for example, the identification of free radical intermediates formation during degradation, oxidation, irradiation, and mechanical fracture and radical polymerization, etc. So in these cases, the free radical are generally transient or relatively short-lived intermediates, and species of this type will be dealt with elsewhere in these volumes. So ESR can also be used to identify parametric species in polymers, to obtain information on the structure and dynamics of their environment, and on length scale up to 10 nanometers, and so up to down to 10 picoseconds also. So time scale can also be down and length scale is also down. For this, therefore, to determine spatial distribution of ESR by ESR imaging, we can say the distribution of elements. So in that cases, it is helpful. So now coming to the questions. So the criteria to be used as inert atmosphere for photoacoustic spectroscopy are. So can anyone answer low thermal conductivity or high capacity, high heat capacity, or high thermal conductivity and low heat capacity? Heat, high thermal conductivity or high heat capacity, or low thermal conductivity and low heat capacity? I have discussed it in my previous slides. Can anyone answer? Yeah, B. So it has to be have a very high thermal conductivity and low heat capacity, so that the interaction can be possible. Then, which of the following statement is correct? The sample art for photoacoustic spectroscopy has to be a transparent film. Nitrogen is preferred over helium as inert atmosphere in photoacoustic spectroscopy analysis. Styrene content of polystyrene can be detected by photoacoustic spectroscopy. None of the B. I don't think so. Yeah, helium is preferred. Yeah. No, it can be used for different materials. It can be used for powders. So that is also not correct. Um, Anyone can answer? No, it is C. We can check the styrene content. I have talked about it in my slides. So that it is. Yeah, here. So here is styrene content. I was talking about this. In the with the help of photoacoustic, we can get peaks, very sharp peaks, and those can be used to determine we can do the quantitative analysis basically for our material. So suppose we have a rubber styrene butadiene rubber, so we can actually quantitate the percentage of styrene in the present in the rubber with respect to the butadiene. So that can be checked using the photoacoustic spectroscopy. So the answer is C. Actually, I hope you understood. Do anyone have doubt? They can ask. Should I move to the next? Yeah. So, which of the following statement is correct? An inelastic collision, kinetic energy is conserved. Uh, then, change in dipole moment correspond to Raman active molecule. Change in polarizability correspond to Raman active molecule. All of the above. Which one should be incorrect? Yeah. The dipole moment change does not do the Raman active molecule. So, it is correct. The relative peak intensity ratio of electron spin resonance spectroscopy for DPP, as I have told just now. So what should it be? Like I told just now. Yeah, the 1, 2, 3, and 3 together. 1, 2, 3, 2. Yeah, yeah. So here we are just actually uh, this can be quantified with the formula, but here we can see the just see the intensity. So suppose here the intensity is less, so it is 1. Then it is little bit increasing. Then 3 means it is also again increasing. Then again decreasing to 1. So like that we are checking. So there are 5 lines, and then those lines we are uh, checking. But this can be quantified with the formulas. I have not included those, so you can refer to the lecture basically for, for this. Actually, yeah. So actually, it is increasing. It is a derivative, right? If I go back to this here. So if you see, if it is 0, the absorbance is highest at that point. So it is a derivative. So that's how we. That's why it is basically it is in 3. Like it is increasing. The intensity is higher. So, but these are quantified with the help of a formula. This Ni, etc. These I have not included those in these slides. But this is the so basically we have in the first peak the intensity is less. Then in 2 it is slightly increasing, and then again it is more like it is going to the negative direction, but it is still increasing. So if we plot the derivative, integrate it, then we get absorbance curve like the Gaussian curve. So in the middle the intensity is high, then 2, then 1, like that. If I plot it here, it will be like in first, then second, then third, then second, then so 5 lines will be there basically. Those can be considered as lines also. So yeah, 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. So these are 5 lines, EPR lines. Okay, I'm going back to the questions. So the option B is the correct one. Then we another question. So these are also I have talked about. So choose the correct type of polarization from the diagram. So different polarization type will give signal at different positions or frequencies. So that so you need to match those. So can anyone tell me which one is the orientational, which one is the ionic, or interfacial, or electronic? D, you are saying B or D? B. Okay. I afraid it is the answer. I okay. Yeah. Yes. So the interfacial is the A, and then orientational, then ionic, and then electronics. Electronics gives at very low, less frequency. So D is the correct answer. I'll go back to that slide if you have confusions. Yeah, this. So here we can see the electronic one is the at 10 to the power minus 15. Sorry, plus 15. Then ionic 10 to the power 11. Then orientational it is around 10 to the power 6. And then interfacial it is around 1. So that is how it is distributed. So anyone have any doubts? This, or else we can conclude the session for today. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. See you in the next.